Hey guys, in the early days of colonial America, life unfolded slowly, shaped by the rhythms of the land and the seasons. Families rose with the sun, tending fields, caring for livestock, and managing homes built from timber and stone. Forests, rivers, and streams surrounded settlements, offering both resources and challenges, while towns slowly grew with markets, workshops, and meeting houses at their center. Every meal, every garment, and every tool required careful labor, learned through generations and shared across households. Beyond the daily routines, communities gathered for worship, seasonal festivals, and the quiet moments of reflection by candlelight or hearth fire. This was a world defined not by speed or convenience, but by patience, resilience, and a profound connection to both nature and one another. In this story, we explore what life truly looked like for those who lived, worked, and built their lives in colonial America. Dawn in colonial America rarely arrived with silence. Before the sky brightened fully, a thin gray light settled across fields, forests, and rough wooden houses that stood scattered across the land. The air carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke from hearths that had burned through the night. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster's call drifted across the cold morning air. Inside small homes made of timber and stone, the first movements of the day had already begun. Life in colonial America was shaped by necessity. Every hour carried purpose, and the rhythm of daily existence followed the slow turning of seasons rather than the ticking of clocks. Most families lived in modest houses built from local materials. In the northern colonies, thick wooden beams formed sturdy frames that held rough planks in place. The spaces between boards were often packed with clay, straw, or moss to keep out wind and cold. The interior of a typical home was small, often consisting of one large room and perhaps a loft above. A central hearth dominated the space. It was the heart of the household, a place where food was cooked, clothes were dried, and warmth spread slowly through the room during long winters. The smoke from the fire curled upward toward a simple chimney, though it did not always escape completely. The smell of burning would linger constantly in clothing, furniture, and hair. Furniture was simple and practical. Tables were heavy and handmade, sometimes uneven where the wood had warped over time. Stools and benches replaced chairs in many homes. Beds were wooden frames filled with straw mattresses covered by coarse linen sheets. Blankets made of wool provided warmth during cold nights, though they were often scratchy against the skin. Clothing was rarely purchased ready-made. Most garments were produced at home through long, patient labor. Wool from sheep was cleaned, carded, spun into yarn, and woven into cloth. Linen came from flax plants grown in small plots near the house. The fibers were processed through soaking, beating, and combing before they could be spun. This work required skill and time, filling many quiet hours during the colder months. Colors were usually plain and natural. Browns, grays, dull blues, and faded greens dominated wardrobes. Bright dyes were expensive and difficult to produce, so most clothing remained subdued. Shirts, skirts, breeches, and jackets were built for durability rather than decoration. Fabric was patched repeatedly when worn, and nothing was thrown away until it could no longer serve even the smallest purpose. Food preparation began early in the morning. The first task often involved reviving the fire in the hearth. Embers from the night before were stirred gently until flames returned. A heavy iron pot might be placed over the fire to heat water or cook porridge made from cornmeal or oats. Bread baked the day before was sliced and sometimes softened with milk or broth. Colonial diets varied depending on location and season. In New England, corn became a staple crop after settlers learned its cultivation from indigenous communities. Cornbread, cornmeal mush, and simple stews appeared frequently on the table. Beans, squash, and pumpkins also grew well in the region's soil. Further south, the longer growing season allowed for a wider range of crops. Tobacco plantations spread across large areas of land, though tobacco itself was not food. It was a valuable export that shaped the economy and labor system of the colonies. Alongside it, fields produced maize, sweet potatoes, peas, and occasionally wheat. Meat was eaten less frequently than many modern people might imagine. Livestock required feed and space, making animals valuable assets. Chickens provided eggs, while pigs were often raised for eventual slaughter. When a pig was butchered, nearly every part was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Preservation methods were essential for survival. Without refrigeration, food had to last through long winters. Apples were dried and stored in cloth bags. Fish was salted heavily before being packed into barrels. Vegetables might be pickled in vinegar or fermented in large stone crocks. Water was collected from wells, springs, or nearby streams. Carrying water was a daily task that demanded strength and patience. Buckets were lifted by rope from deep wells or carried by hand from outdoor sources. In winter, ice formed along the edges of containers, making the work slower and more difficult. Children in colonial households quickly became part of the daily routine. From a young age, they learned practical tasks that helped sustain the family. Small hands gathered firewood, fed chickens, or helped carry water. As they grew older, responsibilities increased steadily. Education varied widely depending on region and family circumstances. In New England, many communities valued literacy for religious reasons. Reading scripture was considered important, so schools appeared in several towns. These schools were often simple one-room buildings where children of different ages studied together. Lessons focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction. Books were scarce, and students frequently shared copies. Learning involved repetition and memorization. Discipline was strict, reflecting the belief that character and obedience were essential virtues. In rural areas farther south, formal schooling was less common. Education sometimes occurred at home, especially among wealthier families who could hire tutors. For many children, however, learning came primarily through observation and practice rather than written instruction. Outside the home, colonial settlements grew slowly. Early towns formed along rivers, coastlines, and fertile valleys. Houses stood close together in some regions, while in others they were separated by fields and forests. Roads were often little more than dirt paths carved through the landscape by carts and wagons. Travel was slow and uncertain. A journey of 20 miles could consume an entire day depending on weather and terrain. Mud in springtime turned roads into thick, clinging tracks that trapped wagon wheels. In winter, snow covered paths completely, forcing travelers to rely on memory and landmarks. Despite these difficulties, trade connected communities. Farmers brought produce, grain, and livestock to local markets. Craftsmen offered tools, barrels, shoes, and furniture. Blacksmiths played an especially important role, shaping iron into nails, hinges, horseshoes, and farm equipment. The sound of hammers striking metal echoed through many towns during the day. Sparks jumped from glowing iron as it was struck repeatedly against the anvil. The smell of hot metal mixed with smoke from coal fires, forming a scent familiar to anyone who passed nearby. Colonial life was deeply tied to the natural world. Weather determined success or failure in farming. A late frost could damage crops. A summer drought might reduce harvests dramatically. Storms along the coast sometimes destroyed fishing boats or flooded fields. Because survival depended so heavily on nature, people watched the sky carefully. Clouds, wind direction, and seasonal patterns offered clues about coming weather. Farmers learned to recognize subtle changes in the environment that hinted at shifting conditions. Evenings arrived quietly in colonial homes. As the sun lowered beyond fields and forests, shadows stretched across the land. Work slowed as daylight faded. Candles and oil lamps provided limited light. So many tasks ended naturally when darkness came. The household gathered near the hearth where warmth and faint light remained. Simple meals were eaten slowly. Bread, soup, vegetables, and sometimes meat-filled wooden bowls placed on rough tables. The atmosphere was calm, shaped by fatigue from a full day of labor. Afterward, smaller tasks continued by firelight. Clothing might be mended, tools repaired, yarn spun carefully between practiced fingers. These activities required patience and steady hands. Outside, the colonial landscape settled into darkness. Without electric lights, the night sky appeared vast and brilliant. Stars stretched across the heavens in patterns that guided travelers and fascinated observers. The quiet was occasionally broken by distant animal calls or the rustling of wind through trees. For many families, sleep arrived early. Beds were shared among siblings or even multiple generations. Straw mattresses shifted slightly underweight as people settled into blankets. The warmth of the hearth slowly faded as embers dimmed. Yet the cycle of labor and rest would begin again long before sunrise. Colonial life demanded endurance, cooperation, and careful use of every available resource. Each day resembled the last in its steady rhythm, yet small variations in weather, work, and community life shaped countless individual experiences. Across forests, farms, and coastal villages, thousands of families followed similar patterns. Their lives unfolded gradually, guided by tradition, necessity, and the slow passage of time in a world that required constant effort simply to endure. Morning mist often lingered above the fields long after the sun had risen. Thin layers of fog drifted slowly over rows of crops and patches of pastureland, softening the outlines of fences and barns. Across the colonial countryside, farms stretched outward from small houses built near wells, creeks, or springs. These farms were not vast estates in most cases. Instead, they were modest plots of land worked carefully by families who depended almost entirely on what the soil could provide. Agriculture shaped nearly every aspect of colonial life. The cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and preserving food created a pattern that repeated year after year. Even the smallest decisions were influenced by the changing seasons. A family's well-being depended on timing, weather, and a deep familiarity with the land they cultivated. During early spring, the landscape began to stir after months of cold stillness. Snow melted gradually in northern colonies, leaving the earth heavy and wet. Streams swelled with fresh water from distant hills. The ground softened enough for plows to cut into its surface, turning dark soil that had rested beneath frost. Plowing required patience and strength. Wooden plows fitted with iron blades were guided through the fields behind teams of oxen or horses. The animals moved slowly but steadily, pulling the heavy tool forward while the farmer steered it carefully through the soil. Each long furrow opened the ground, preparing it to receive seeds. Corn often occupied a central place in colonial farming. Settlers had learned from indigenous agricultural knowledge that corn thrived in the climate and soil of North America. Seeds were planted in small hills rather than long rows. Beans and squash were sometimes grown alongside the corn, creating a system in which each plant supported the others in subtle ways. Wheat and rye were also important crops, particularly in the middle colonies where fertile land supported grain farming. Fields of ripening grain created gentle waves across the countryside when summer winds passed through them. The golden heads of wheat bent slightly under their own weight as harvest approached. Vegetable gardens grew close to the house, where they could be tended easily. These gardens contained cabbages, onions, carrots, turnips, peas, and herbs used for cooking and medicine. Narrow paths between beds allowed gardeners to move carefully among the plants while removing weeds or gathering produce. Fruit trees often stood nearby as well. Apple orchards were common throughout many colonies. Apples served many purposes beyond simple eating. They could be dried, baked into pies, pressed into cider, or fermented for storage. A well-established orchard became a valuable resource for any household. The work required to maintain a farm filled nearly every daylight hour. Fences needed constant repair. Wooden rails shifted or broke over time, especially after storms or harsh winters. Livestock depended on these barriers to keep them from wandering into crops or nearby forests. Animals formed another important part of farm life. Cows provided milk that could be turned into butter or cheese. Chickens wandered freely around the yard, scratching the ground in search of insects and seeds. Their eggs offered a steady source of nourishment throughout the year. Sheep grazed quietly in open fields, their thick wool growing steadily as the months passed. When spring arrived, shearing began. Heavy fleeces were cut carefully from the animals and cleaned before being spun into yarn. This wool eventually became clothing, blankets, and other useful items within the household. Pigs required less attention than many other animals, which made them especially useful for colonial families. They could roam through wooded areas where they searched for acorns, roots, and fallen fruit. When autumn arrived, pigs were often brought back from the forest to be prepared for winter butchering. Harvest time was one of the busiest periods of the year. As summer faded and cooler air moved across the land, crops reached maturity. Every available hand joined in gathering the produce that would sustain families through the coming winter. Grain fields were cut using curved sickles that sliced through stalks with careful movements. Workers moved slowly across the field, gathering bundles of wheat or rye that were tied together and stacked upright to dry. Later, the grain would be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the husks. Corn harvest involved pulling ears from tall stalks and piling them into large baskets or carts. Some corn was used immediately for food, while much of it was stored for later use. Dried corn kernels could last for many months when kept in dry conditions. Root vegetables were lifted from the soil and placed in cellars dug beneath houses or nearby storage buildings. These underground spaces stayed cool throughout the year, protecting food from spoilage. Turnips, carrots, and potatoes could remain edible for long periods when stored carefully. Cabbages were sometimes preserved by fermentation, a process that allowed them to remain usable long after harvest. Barrels filled with shredded cabbage and salt slowly transformed into a tangy food that could accompany meals during the cold months ahead. Autumn also brought the preparation of firewood. Trees were cut and split into manageable pieces that would feed hearth fires throughout winter. Stacks of logs grew beside houses and barns, forming tall rows that dried gradually in the open air. The smell of freshly cut wood drifted across farmyards during these weeks. The steady rhythm of axes striking trunks echoed through forests as neighbors worked their land. Gathering enough wood was essential, since warmth depended entirely on burning fuel inside the home. As winter approached, the pace of outdoor labor gradually slowed. Frost hardened the ground, and snow began to settle across fields and hills. Farming tasks shifted indoors where different kinds of work filled the shorter days. Spinning wheels turned steadily in many homes. Women and older children transformed wool and flax fibers into thread or yarn. The soft whirring sound of the spinning wheel often accompanied quiet winter evenings as cloth slowly took shape. Weaving required large wooden looms that occupied significant space within the house or an outbuilding. Threads stretched across the frame, while a shuttle carried yarn back and forth through the warp. The process demanded patience and skill, yet it produced sturdy fabric used for clothing and blankets. Leatherworking was another winter activity. Hides from animals slaughtered in autumn were cleaned, stretched, and treated to prevent decay. Once prepared, the leather could be cut into shoes, belts, harnesses, and other essential items. Meanwhile, tools used during the growing season were repaired and sharpened. Metal blades dulled by months of use needed attention. Handles loosened by repeated strikes were replaced with fresh wood carved to fit comfortably in the hand. Even during winter, some outdoor tasks continued. Livestock required daily care regardless of weather. Snow had to be cleared from barn entrances, and water sources sometimes froze solid during especially cold nights. Breaking ice became part of the morning routine in many regions. The quiet stillness of winter carried its own challenges. Travel became more difficult as snow covered roads and trails. Yet frozen ground sometimes made sled transport easier than wheeled wagons. Farmers occasionally hauled heavy loads using wooden sledges pulled by horses across packed snow. Despite these hardships, winter also offered moments of slower pace. Without constant fieldwork, families spent more time indoors where shared activities strengthened bonds between generations. Skills were passed from elders to children through steady practice rather than formal instruction. Religious observance played an important role in many colonial communities throughout the year. Churches or meeting houses served as gathering places where people assembled regularly. These buildings were often plain structures built from wood with simple benches arranged inside. Travel to these gatherings sometimes required walking several miles across rough terrain. Despite the effort involved, attendance remained an important social and spiritual practice for many colonists. The meetings provided opportunities to connect with neighbors who might otherwise remain distant during busy farming seasons. Community cooperation often appeared during periods of intense labor. Barn raisings, for example, brought many families together to construct large wooden structures quickly. Heavy beams were lifted into place through coordinated effort, allowing a barn to rise within a single day. These events combined work with a sense of shared purpose. After the structure stood complete, food and simple celebrations often followed. Such moments offered brief relief from the demanding routine of rural life. The land surrounding colonial farms remained vast and only partially cleared. Dense forests covered enormous areas beyond cultivated fields. These woodlands supplied timber, firewood, and wild game. But they also reminded settlers of the immense natural world that existed beyond their settlements. Deer moved quietly through the trees, leaving narrow paths between undergrowth. Wild turkeys roamed in small groups across forest floors. Rivers and streams provided fish that supplemented diets when caught with nets, lines, or simple traps. Hunting and fishing required knowledge passed through experience. Observing animal tracks, understanding seasonal movement patterns, and recognizing the habits of wildlife were essential skills for anyone who relied on the forest for food. In these ways, farming households existed in constant interaction with their surroundings. The boundaries between cultivated land and wilderness remained thin. Every cleared field represented years of labor spent removing trees, pulling roots, and shaping the earth for planting. Yet the forest never stood entirely still. Saplings emerged in open spaces, and creeping vines slowly returned to neglected areas. Without careful maintenance, nature gradually reclaimed the land that settlers had worked so hard to prepare. Through each changing season, colonial farmers adapted to the demands of weather, soil, and time. Their lives unfolded according to cycles far older than the settlements themselves. The turning of these cycles guided planting, harvest, preservation, and rest. And beyond the quiet farms scattered across valleys and hills, small towns and growing ports began to form centers of trade and craftsmanship, places where rural produce met skilled labor, and where another side of colonial life unfolded with its own rhythms and routines. Where country roads converged and rivers widened into sheltered harbors, settlements gradually transformed into busy towns. These places developed a character different from the quiet rhythm of scattered farms. The sounds of wagons rolling over packed earth, the creak of wooden signs swaying in the wind, and the steady movement of people filled the narrow streets. While rural households focused on survival through agriculture, towns became centers of craft, trade, and connection. Buildings in colonial towns stood closer together than those in the countryside. Houses lined uneven streets, their wooden frames leaning slightly after years of weather and shifting ground. Some were 2 stories tall, with steep roofs designed to shed snow and rain. Others were simple single-floor dwellings with small windows set into thick walls. Many structures combined living quarters with places of work, allowing artisans to practice their trades just steps from their front doors. Shops opened early in the morning, often marked by hanging symbols that indicated the craft practiced inside. A boot suspended above a doorway signaled the presence of a shoemaker. A wooden barrel suggested a cooper's workshop where casts were built for storage and transport. These signs helped visitors identify services even if they could not read written words. Inside a blacksmith's forge, heat shimmered above glowing coals. Iron bars rested beside the hearth, waiting to be shaped into tools or hardware. The smith worked steadily, drawing heated metal from the fire with long tongs before striking it against the anvil. Each blow sent sparks scattering across the packed dirt floor. The clang of hammer against iron echoed through nearby streets, a familiar sound in nearly every colonial settlement. Carpenters maintained a different rhythm of labor. Their workshops smelled strongly of fresh wood and resin. Long planks leaned against walls while shavings curled across workbenches. Using saws, chisels, and planes, they crafted doors, furniture, window frames, and structural beams for houses. Wood remained the most accessible building material, making skilled carpentry essential for growing communities. Coopers specialized in shaping wooden staves into barrels that could hold flour, salted fish, pickled vegetables, and liquids such as cider or rum. Their craft demanded precision. Each curved piece had to fit perfectly with the next so that the finished container would hold its contents without leaking. Hoops of iron or strong wood secured the structure tightly together. Tailors and seamstresses worked with fabrics produced locally or imported from overseas. Their workspaces contained bolts of cloth folded carefully along shelves. Needles, thread, and small iron scissors rested on tables beside half-finished garments. Creating clothing for townspeople required attention to measurements and patience during long hours of stitching. Apothecaries maintained small collections of dried plants, powders, and liquids used in remedies for illness or injury. Glass jars and ceramic containers lined wooden shelves inside these shops. Many treatments relied on traditional herbal knowledge carried from Europe or learned locally through experience with unfamiliar plants. Markets formed an important gathering place within town centers. Farmers from surrounding countryside arrived with carts filled with produce, eggs, butter, and meat. Their goods were displayed on rough tables or directly from wagons. Buyers moved slowly among the stalls, examining items before making purchases. The smell of fresh bread often drifted from bakeries where large brick ovens produced loaves throughout the morning. Flour dust lingered in the air as workers kneaded dough on broad wooden boards. Once baked, bread cooled on racks before being sold to households that lacked the time or equipment to bake regularly. Fishing communities along the coast added another layer of activity. Boats returned to shore carrying nets heavy with cod, mackerel, or other local fish. Workers cleaned and salted the catch along wooden docks before packing it into barrels for transport. The scent of seawater and fish hung strongly over these harbors. Shipbuilding yards occupied sections of shoreline where forests had provided abundant timber. Tall frames of unfinished vessels rose above the ground like skeletal structures. Carpenters and shipwrights moved across scaffolding, fitting planks along curved hulls that would eventually carry cargo across vast stretches of ocean. Trade connected colonial towns to distant regions of the world. Ships arrived from Europe carrying cloth, metal tools, books, ceramics, and other manufactured goods. In return, colonial exports such as tobacco, timber, furs, grain, and fish filled the holds of departing vessels. The docks became lively places during these exchanges. Crates and barrels were lifted carefully from ships using ropes and wooden cranes. Workers balanced heavy loads across narrow gangplanks while keeping steady footing above the moving water. Merchants played a central role in this system of exchange. Their warehouses stored goods awaiting sale or shipment. Ledgers recorded transactions in neat rows of inked numbers and names. Through these records, merchants tracked the flow of products moving between continents. Life in towns also included institutions that supported community order. Courthouses handled legal disputes ranging from property boundaries to unpaid debts. These buildings often stood near central squares where important announcements were made and official notices were posted. Printing presses introduced another important dimension to colonial society. Street conditions varied widely. Some areas contained wooden planks laid across muddy ground to make walking easier. In other places, bare earth turned into thick mud after rainstorms. Wagons carved deep ruts that hardened when dry, creating uneven paths for pedestrians. Animals moved freely through many streets. Chickens pecked at scraps, dogs wandered between houses, and pigs occasionally rooted through discarded food near market areas. Managing waste remained a challenge in crowded settlements, especially during warm months. Despite these difficulties, towns offered opportunities unavailable in isolated rural areas. Apprenticeships allowed young people to learn specialized crafts under experienced masters. A boy might spend several years in a workshop acquiring skills necessary to become a carpenter, printer, or metalworker. This arrangement involved living within the household of the master craftsman. Apprentices performed various tasks while gradually learning the details of the trade. Over time, they gained enough knowledge to work independently or establish shops of their own. Women also contributed significantly to urban economic life. Some managed shops or inns where travelers could find lodging and meals. Others produced goods such as candles, soap, or textiles for sale within local markets, and served as gathering points for travelers, merchants, and local residents. Their interiors contained large fireplaces, sturdy tables, and benches arranged across common rooms. Food and drink were prepared in kitchens that remained busy throughout the day. Travelers arriving after long journeys often rested here before continuing along trade routes or coastal roads. These establishments provided shelter from harsh weather and offered space where news circulated among visitors from distant regions. As evening approached, activity within towns gradually slowed. Market stalls were dismantled, shop doors closed, and carts returned to nearby farms. Lanterns appeared along streets as darkness spread between buildings. Inside homes, Candles flickered beside windows while families prepared evening meals. The sounds of footsteps and quiet conversation carried through narrow lanes before fading into the calm of night. Harbors settled into relative stillness once ships were secured with heavy ropes. Gentle waves rocked the vessels as lanterns glowed faintly along their decks. The smell of tar, rope, and salt water lingered over the quiet waterfront. Above the rooftops, stars appeared gradually across the darkening sky. Their reflections shimmered faintly on rivers and harbor waters that bordered many colonial towns. Within these settlements, countless individuals contributed their skills and labor to the growing network of colonial society. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, sailors, teachers, and laborers all formed parts of a complex system that extended far beyond any single street or harbor. And while these towns connected distant places through commerce and communication, another world existed beyond their boundaries, one shaped by forests, frontiers, and encounters that unfolded along the edges of colonial expansion. Beyond the settled towns and carefully cleared farms, a different landscape stretched outward across the continent. Dense forests covered immense distances, their canopies forming deep green corridors where sunlight filtered through layers of leaves and branches. The ground beneath these trees remained cool and shaded for much of the day, scattered with fallen logs, moss, and the slow growth of ferns. For many colonists, the frontier represented both opportunity and uncertainty. Families sometimes traveled far beyond established settlements in search of new land. These journeys required courage as well as endurance, since the regions ahead were often unfamiliar and only lightly mapped. Travel through these areas rarely followed straight routes. Narrow trails wound between trees, across hills, and alongside rivers. Some of these paths had existed long before colonial arrival, used by indigenous communities who understood the terrain through generations of experience. Settlers occasionally relied on these routes when moving deeper into the interior. Wagons moved slowly along rough tracks cut through woodland. Their wooden wheels creaked as they rolled over roots and stones hidden beneath leaves and soil. Horses or oxen pulled the heavy loads, pausing frequently as drivers cleared obstacles from the path ahead. The forests themselves contained a remarkable variety of life. Tall oak and chestnut trees towered above younger growth, their branches spreading widely across the sky. In certain regions, pines rose in straight lines that seemed almost endless. During autumn, the leaves transformed into rich shades of amber, red, and gold before drifting quietly to the ground. Wildlife moved cautiously through these environments. Deer stepped softly between tree trunks, alert to every sound. Black bears searched for berries or insects beneath fallen logs. Smaller animals, foxes, rabbits, and raccoons, traveled along hidden routes worn into the undergrowth. Colonists who ventured into the forest for hunting or exploration carried tools suited to survival. Muskets rested across shoulders, while knives hung from belts for practical use. Powder horns containing gunpowder and small pouches filled with lead shot were essential equipment during these excursions. Hunting required careful observation. Tracks pressed into damp soil revealed recent movement. Broken twigs and disturbed leaves hinted at passing animals. Success often depended on patience and an ability to remain still for long periods. Beyond providing food, forests supplied valuable materials used in daily life. Trees offered timber for construction, while bark and plant fibers served practical purposes in tanning leather or creating rope. Resin collected from certain trees could be used for waterproofing wooden surfaces. Some settlers established small cabins along the frontier as temporary shelters while clearing land. These structures were often built quickly using logs stacked horizontally and secured at the corners with simple notches. The gaps between logs were filled with clay or moss to block cold air. The interior of a frontier cabin remained extremely simple. A single room contained a hearth made of stone where fires burned continuously during colder months. Rough wooden beds stood against the walls, covered with blankets woven from wool. A small table and several stools completed the modest arrangement. Life in these remote areas demanded constant labor. Trees had to be cut and removed before crops could be planted. This process took months or even years depending on the density of the forest. Large trunks were chopped into sections and dragged aside, or burned in controlled fires. Stumps left behind after felling trees created obstacles across newly cleared fields. Removing them required digging around deep roots or allowing time for natural decay. Until then, farmers navigated carefully between these remnants when plowing their land. Rivers served as important pathways through the frontier. Waterways allowed movement that was often easier than traveling through thick woodland. Canoes and small boats glided along currents carrying supplies, furs, or travelers between distant locations. The design of these vessels reflected practical knowledge suited to river navigation. Some were carved from single tree trunks, forming long hollow shapes capable of carrying several people and cargo. Others were assembled from wooden planks fastened together with careful craftsmanship. Riverbanks sometimes supported small trading posts where goods exchanged hands between different groups. These outposts consisted of simple buildings surrounded by wooden palisades for protection. Inside their walls, traders stored furs, tools, cloth, and other items awaiting exchange. The fur trade formed a significant part of the colonial economy in northern regions. Animal pelts from beavers, foxes, and other species were highly valued for their use in clothing and hat production. Hunters traveled far into wilderness areas to collect these furs before bringing them back to trading centers. Winter expeditions across snowy landscapes required special preparation. Snowshoes allowed travelers to walk across deep drifts without sinking. These wide frames distributed weight evenly, making movement possible even when snow covered the ground in thick layers. Cold air sharpened every sound during such journeys. The crunch of snow beneath each step echoed across quiet valleys. Frost coated branches and turned streams into narrow ribbons of ice. In warmer seasons, rivers expanded with rainfall and melting snow from distant mountains. Canoes moved swiftly along these currents, though sudden rapids or hidden rocks could create dangerous conditions. Skilled navigation depended on reading subtle patterns in the water's surface. Frontier communities often remained small and scattered. A handful of families might settle within walking distance of one another, forming loose networks of cooperation. When large tasks arose, such as building homes or harvesting crops, neighbors gathered to assist one another. Communication between distant settlements relied heavily on physical travel. Messages carried by riders or travelers moved slowly across long distances. Weeks might pass before news from a neighboring region arrived. Yet despite isolation, these communities maintained connections through shared traditions and seasonal gatherings. Religious meetings, markets, or harvest celebrations occasionally drew families together from miles around. Children growing up in frontier environments developed practical skills at an early age. They learned to recognize edible plants, navigate forest paths, and assist with tasks necessary for survival. Their surroundings became familiar landscapes shaped by exploration and daily experience. Weather conditions influenced every activity. Heavy rain transformed forest trails into slippery passages, while summer heat filled the air with the buzzing of insects. Thunderstorms rolled across valleys with sudden intensity, their flashes illuminating dark clouds above the treetops. During autumn, migrating birds filled the sky as they traveled southward. Their formations stretched across the horizon in graceful patterns that shifted constantly with the wind. Nightfall in frontier regions brought a deep and profound darkness. Without the glow of town lanterns or clustered houses, the forest absorbed nearly all light. Only the faint flicker of cabin fires marked the presence of human habitation within the vast wilderness. Stars shone brilliantly above the treetops, forming familiar constellations that guided travelers and fascinated observers. The silence of these nights was occasionally interrupted by distant animal calls or the whisper of wind moving through branches. Despite the challenges of frontier life, many settlers believed that the effort required to establish new homes would eventually lead to stability and prosperity. Each cleared field, each cabin raised among the trees, represented a step toward creating permanent communities within the immense landscape. Over time, paths widened into roads as more travelers passed along them. Additional cabins appeared near the first structures. Small meeting houses and trading stores followed. Gradually, isolated clearings began to resemble the earliest stages of new villages. Through persistence and cooperation, These remote outposts slowly joined the broader network of colonial society. Goods produced in distant farms or forests eventually found their way to towns and ports where they entered wider systems of trade. In this way, the frontier formed a shifting boundary between established settlements and the immense territories beyond. Life along that boundary demanded resilience and adaptability, qualities that shaped the experiences of those who chose to live at the edge of the colonial world. And while forests and rivers defined the outer limits of expansion, the interior of colonial households carried its own rhythms, spaces where family life unfolded quietly within walls warmed by firelight and guided by traditions that shaped daily existence. Inside colonial homes, daily life unfolded through a steady pattern of small tasks and quiet routines. While the outside world was shaped by fields, forests, and markets, the interior of the household formed its own environment, one built around care, maintenance, and the steady management of resources that could not easily be replaced. The hearth remained the central feature of nearly every dwelling. Built from brick or stone, it extended outward into the main room, where cooking fires burned for most of the day. Iron hooks hung above the flames, allowing pots to be suspended at different heights depending on the intensity of heat required. A long-handled tool could swing these hooks forward or backward, adjusting the position of the pot without disturbing the fire itself. Cooking required patience rather than strict measurement. Ingredients were combined through experience gained over years of practice. Thick stews simmered slowly in iron kettles, their surfaces releasing gentle curls of steam that carried the aroma of vegetables, herbs, and occasionally meat. Cornmeal porridge remained a frequent morning meal, warmed carefully so it would not burn against the bottom of the pot. Baking took place inside ovens constructed within the hearth structure. Before bread could be placed inside, the interior chamber had to be heated by burning wood within it. Once the bricks absorbed sufficient warmth, the remaining embers were swept aside. Dough shaped into round loaves was then placed inside the hot space, and the door closed to trap the heat. The smell of baking bread often filled the house during these moments. The crust gradually darkened while the interior softened into a dense, nourishing texture. Fresh loaves cooled on wooden boards before being sliced for meals that might last several days. Butter making formed another regular chore. Milk collected from cows was allowed to settle so that cream rose to the top. This cream was poured into a tall wooden churn where it was agitated repeatedly with a vertical handle. The constant movement eventually caused the fat within the cream to separate, forming solid butter that could be gathered and pressed into small blocks. Salt was sometimes added to preserve the butter longer. Without it, the product spoiled quickly, particularly during warmer months. Stored in cool areas, these small portions became valuable additions to meals throughout the week. Cheese production followed a similar process of transformation. Milk warmed near the hearth combined with natural curdling agents, creating thick clumps that separated from liquid whey. These curds were pressed into molds and allowed to age over time, developing firmer textures and stronger flavors. Soap making occurred only a few times each year, but required careful preparation. Animal fats saved from cooking were melted and combined with lye derived from wood ash. The mixture thickened gradually as it was stirred over gentle heat. Once poured into molds and left to harden, the resulting bars were cut and stored for later use in washing clothes and cleaning surfaces. Lighting inside colonial homes depended mainly on candles and small oil lamps. Candles were often produced from tallow, a material made from animal fat. The melted substance was poured repeatedly over a suspended wick until it built up into a long, narrow cylinder. These candles burned steadily but carried a faint scent that lingered in enclosed spaces. More expensive versions made from beeswax produced brighter flames and a cleaner aroma, though they remained less common in ordinary households. Regardless of the material, candlelight remained limited, encouraging families to organize their work around daylight hours whenever possible. Laundry involved a process far more demanding than modern methods. Large wooden tubs were filled with heated water carried from the hearth. Clothes were soaked and scrubbed vigorously against rough surfaces before being rinsed and wrung out by hand. During warmer weather, garments were hung across ropes or wooden frames outside where sunlight and wind could dry them naturally. In winter, clothing sometimes dried slowly near the fire, filling the house with damp warmth. Childhood within colonial homes included both responsibility and learning through participation. Young children observed older family members performing daily work, gradually joining in as their abilities developed. A small child might begin by carrying kindling to the hearth or gathering eggs from nesting boxes. As years passed, tasks grew more complex. Boys frequently assisted with outdoor work such as splitting wood, tending animals, or helping repair fences. Girls often became involved in spinning, sewing, and food preparation, though these roles sometimes overlapped depending on the needs of the household. Toys were simple objects made from available materials. Wooden figures carved by hand, cloth dolls filled with scraps, or small hoops rolled along the ground provided moments of play between periods of work. Games required imagination rather than elaborate equipment. Health and medicine presented constant concerns in colonial life. Illness could appear suddenly and spread quickly within close living spaces. Without modern medical knowledge, families relied heavily on herbal remedies, traditional practices, and the guidance of local healers. Gardens often included plants known for their medicinal qualities. Mint leaves could ease stomach discomfort. Willow bark contained compounds useful for relieving pain. Chamomile flowers were dried and steeped in warm water to create soothing infusions. When injuries occurred, treatments involved careful cleaning and simple bandaging using linen cloth. Broken bones required steady splinting while the body healed naturally. Recovery often depended on rest, nutrition, and patience. Childbirth represented one of the most significant events within the household. Midwives assisted during these moments, bringing experience gained through years of helping families welcome new members. Their presence offered reassurance and practical knowledge during a time that carried both hope and risk. The arrival of a child gradually altered the rhythms of daily life. Cradles were placed near the hearth where warmth and gentle rocking soothed infants during their earliest months. Older siblings often helped care for younger family members, strengthening bonds within the household. Meals provided moments when the family gathered together. Wooden bowls and pewter plates held portions of stew, vegetables, or bread placed upon the table. Utensils remained limited. So many foods were eaten using spoons or fingers. Clean water and simple drinks such as cider or small beer accompanied these meals. The low alcohol content of small beer made it a common beverage for adults and children alike, particularly in areas where water sources were uncertain. After eating, dishes were washed in basins of warm water and returned to shelves or cupboards built along the walls. Careful organization helped ensure that valuable utensils remained protected from damage or loss. Seasonal celebrations occasionally interrupted the routine of ordinary days. Harvest festivals marked the completion of agricultural labor before winter arrived. Homes were decorated with dried plants, woven garlands, or bundles of grain symbolizing abundance. Music sometimes accompanied these gatherings. Simple instruments such as fiddles or flutes produced melodies that echoed softly within wooden rooms. Dancing provided moments of enjoyment that contrasted with the steady demands of daily labor. Winter evenings encouraged storytelling and quiet crafts. As wind moved across the outside landscape, families remained indoors near the warmth of the fire. Hands remained busy with knitting, carving, or mending while minds wandered through tales passed from one generation to the next. Letters occasionally arrived from distant relatives or friends living in other colonies or across the ocean. These carefully folded papers carried news that connected households to a wider world beyond their immediate surroundings. Reading such messages allowed every member of the family to share in the information they contained. Despite the many tasks required to maintain a home, moments of reflection sometimes appeared during quieter hours. Watching flames shift within the hearth or observing snowfall through small window panes provided brief pauses within otherwise busy days. Through patience, cooperation, and practical knowledge, colonial families managed the countless details necessary for sustaining life. Their homes functioned as centers of production as much as places of shelter, where nearly everything required for survival was created, repaired, or preserved through careful effort. Beyond these walls, however, larger social structures influenced the colonies in ways that reached into even the most remote households. Systems of labor, trade, and hierarchy that shaped opportunities and hardships across the growing colonial world. Across the colonies, labor shaped nearly every structure of society. Fields, workshops, kitchens, and docks all depended on human effort carried out hour after hour. Beneath the surface of ordinary routines existed a complex system of work that connected people of different backgrounds, circumstances, and freedoms. Some individuals labored on land they owned, others worked under contracts, and many endured lives defined by forced service. In the early decades of settlement, indentured servitude became a common arrangement, particularly in regions where labor was needed for agriculture. Young men and women from Europe often agreed to serve colonial households for a fixed number of years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. The journey itself lasted weeks or sometimes months, depending on weather and sea conditions. Ships carrying these travelers crossed the ocean slowly, pushed forward by wind filling large canvas sails. Below the decks, cramped quarters held passengers and supplies packed tightly together. The constant movement of waves beneath the hull created a rhythm that shaped daily life aboard the vessel. Upon arrival, indentured workers were assigned to farms, workshops, or households where they completed the terms of their contracts. During these years, they performed many of the tasks required to maintain colonial operations. Field labor, construction, and domestic work filled their days. Life under such agreements could be demanding. The duration of service usually ranged between 4 and 7 years, during which time the worker had limited personal freedom. Yet once the contract ended, the individual often received clothing, tools, or small plots of land that allowed the beginning of an independent life. In certain regions, particularly the southern colonies, large plantations began to expand across fertile land near rivers and coastal plains. Crops such as tobacco and later rice required significant labor to plant, maintain, and harvest. The growth of these plantations led to a different labor system that would shape colonial society in lasting ways. Enslaved Africans were brought to North America through the transatlantic slave trade. Their forced migration represented one of the most tragic movements of people in early American history. Ships arrived carrying individuals who had been removed from their homes and transported across the ocean under harsh conditions. Upon arrival in the colonies, these individuals were compelled to work without compensation and without the possibility of leaving their circumstances. Many plantations relied heavily on their labor to cultivate crops that would be sold in distant markets. Daily life for enslaved workers involved long hours in the fields. Rows of tobacco plants stretched across acres of land, requiring constant care. Leaves had to be tended carefully so that they would grow properly before harvest. Later, the harvested leaves were hung inside curing barns where controlled air and time transformed them into a product ready for export. Rice cultivation in the coastal regions of the southern colonies demanded different skills. Fields were flooded intentionally, creating shallow water environments where rice plants could grow. Workers constructed complex systems of canals and dikes to manage the flow of water between fields. The climate of these areas was often hot and humid, adding further difficulty to the already demanding labor. Despite these hardships, enslaved communities preserved cultural traditions brought from Africa. Music, food preparation methods, and agricultural knowledge carried across generations through memory and shared practice. Within plantation households, enslaved individuals also worked in domestic roles. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, and caring for children formed part of their responsibilities. These duties took place within kitchens, laundry areas, and storage rooms that supported the daily functioning of large estates. Plantations themselves operated as small communities. The main house often stood near barns, storage buildings, workshops, and rows of small cabins where enslaved workers lived. Paths connected these structures, forming networks of movement across the land. Supervisors known as overseers managed fieldwork and ensured that tasks were completed according to plantation schedules. Their presence maintained strict control over daily routines, from sunrise to evening darkness. Not all colonial labor occurred in agriculture. Skilled trades provided essential services that kept towns and settlements functioning. Brickmakers shaped clay into rectangular blocks that hardened through intense heat in large kilns. These bricks became durable materials for chimneys, foundations, and public buildings. Tanners transformed animal hides into leather using methods that involved soaking skins in mixtures of bark and water for extended periods. The process produced strong material used for shoes, belts, saddles, and other items needed in everyday life. Paper production developed slowly within certain colonies. Rags collected from worn clothing were processed into pulp before being pressed into thin sheets. These sheets dried carefully before being used for writing or printing. Glassmakers also contributed specialized skills. Sand combined with heat inside large furnaces created molten material that could be shaped into bottles, jars, and window panes. The glow from these furnaces illuminated workshops late into the evening as artisans shaped fragile objects with careful movements. Transportation networks linked these industries to distant markets. Wagons carried goods along roads that connected inland farms with coastal ports. Drivers guided teams of horses along these routes while managing cargo secured in wooden crates or barrels. River transport offered another efficient method for moving goods. Flat-bottomed boats drifted downstream carrying grain, timber, or livestock toward larger towns. Returning upstream required poles or sails depending on wind and water conditions. Ports along the Atlantic coastline served as gateways between the colonies and the wider world. Ships anchored near docks where longshoremen unloaded cargo from distant lands. Tea, spices, cloth, and metal tools entered colonial markets through these harbors. Meanwhile, colonial products departed for Europe and the Caribbean. Barrels of salted fish, bundles of timber, and sacks of grain filled ship holds before departure. This steady exchange created economic connections that stretched across oceans. Labor in maritime industries demanded resilience as well. Sailors spent long periods at sea navigating uncertain weather patterns. Climbing rigging high above the deck required balance and strength while adjusting sails during strong winds. Ship captains relied on navigation tools such as compasses and sextants to determine direction and position. Charts marked known coastlines, though many areas remained imperfectly mapped. The return of ships to port often drew crowds along the waterfront. Merchants, workers, and curious residents gathered to watch the arrival of vessels that had traveled vast distances across open water. Within colonial communities, differences in wealth and status influenced daily experiences. Some families possessed large properties and numerous workers, while others lived modestly through personal labor. These contrasts shaped the social structure of towns and rural areas alike. Public gatherings sometimes brought people of different backgrounds together. Markets, religious services, and seasonal festivals provided occasions when residents shared common spaces despite differing circumstances. Local governments oversaw certain aspects of community life. Councils managed roads, maintained order, and addressed disputes between residents. Meetings held within town halls allowed decisions to be recorded and announced publicly. Through these systems of labor, trade, and governance, colonial society continued to expand. Each individual contributed in some way to the complex web of activity that sustained daily life across farms, towns, and plantations. And beyond these systems of work and authority, moments of celebration, tradition, and shared culture slowly developed. Customs that added warmth and meaning to lives otherwise shaped by constant effort and responsibility. Throughout the year, colonial communities observed a rhythm marked not only by labor, but also by gatherings that strengthened social ties. These occasions varied from solemn religious observances to lively seasonal festivals, each providing moments when ordinary routines softened and neighbors shared time together. Though work remained constant in colonial life, people still found ways to mark the passing of seasons with tradition and reflection. Churches and meeting houses formed the center of many social activities. These structures were often plain buildings made from timber or brick, standing near town greens or at crossroads in rural districts. Inside, long wooden benches faced a raised pulpit from which religious leaders guided congregations through sermons and prayers. Attendance at these services was considered an important duty in many regions. Families prepared carefully on the morning of worship, wearing their cleanest garments and traveling together along dusty roads or narrow forest paths. Some journeys required walking several miles, particularly in sparsely settled areas. The interior atmosphere of a meeting house was quiet and restrained. Sunlight entered through tall windows, illuminating rows of seated worshippers. Hymns were sometimes sung in slow, measured tones that echoed softly against wooden walls. During colder months, small foot warmers filled with hot coals helped individuals endure the chill inside unheated buildings. Beyond spiritual reflection, these gatherings offered opportunities to exchange news and maintain connections among neighbors. After services concluded, people often lingered outdoors, discussing harvests, travel conditions, or developments in nearby towns. Seasonal celebrations brought a different energy to colonial life. Harvest time, in particular, created moments of shared satisfaction after months of demanding agricultural work. Families gathered to prepare meals featuring fresh produce from their fields and gardens. Large wooden tables were sometimes arranged outdoors beneath open skies. Bowls filled with roasted vegetables, bread, stewed meats, and preserved fruits were passed between guests. The flavors of autumn, apples, pumpkins, and newly harvested grains appeared frequently in these dishes. Music accompanied many of these gatherings. Fiddles produced lively melodies while wooden flutes added gentle harmonies. Simple rhythms encouraged dancing that continued into the evening hours as lanterns flickered against the darkness. Winter introduced its own customs as cold weather settled across the colonies. Snow-covered fields and forests, creating landscapes of quiet brightness beneath pale sunlight. During this season, families spent more time indoors where communal activities offered comfort against the harsh climate. Storytelling became a familiar pastime on long winter nights. Older members of the household recounted experiences from earlier years or shared tales passed through generations. These narratives often carried lessons about resilience, caution, and the unpredictable nature of the world. Handcrafts filled many of these evenings as well. Knitting needles moved steadily through yarn, creating stockings, scarves, and blankets. Carvers shaped small objects from wood while seated near the warmth of the hearth. Candlelight flickered across the room, casting shifting shadows on walls and ceilings. Certain holidays brought additional traditions. In some colonies, Christmas included modest decorations made from evergreen branches placed around doorways or mantels. Families prepared special meals and occasionally exchanged small handmade gifts. In other regions, particularly those influenced by strict religious customs, celebrations remained quieter. Days of reflection and prayer took precedence over elaborate festivities. Even so, these occasions marked time in ways that distinguished them from ordinary days. Spring gradually returned warmth to the land after months of frost. Melting snow fed streams and rivers that flowed more quickly through valleys and lowlands. As the ground softened, farmers resumed the demanding work of preparing fields for planting. Communities sometimes organized collective efforts to repair roads damaged by winter conditions. Deep ruts left by wagons were filled with gravel or packed earth. Fallen branches were cleared from pathways that connected farms with markets and neighboring towns. Markets themselves grew lively again as travel became easier. Farmers arrived with early produce such as greens, herbs, and eggs. The sound of voices filled the marketplace while buyers inspected goods displayed on wooden stalls. Springtime also introduced court days in certain towns where legal matters were addressed. People gathered near courthouses to observe proceedings, settle disputes, or record agreements involving land and property. Public announcements were often posted on wooden boards or nailed to building doors. These notices contained information about auctions, lost items, or upcoming community meetings. Reading such messages allowed residents to remain informed about local affairs. Education continued through both formal and informal settings. In towns with established schools, children gathered in simple classrooms where instructors guided lessons using chalkboards and handwritten materials. Students practiced writing letters carefully across paper while repeating arithmetic exercises. In rural areas, learning often occurred within the household. Parents taught practical knowledge related to farming, navigation of nearby terrain, and maintenance of tools. Books were valuable possessions, and those available were read repeatedly. Libraries slowly began appearing within some communities, though their collections remained small. Shelves held volumes covering history, religion, philosophy, and science. Access to these books allowed certain individuals to expand their understanding beyond immediate surroundings. Artistic expression also found modest outlets. Portrait painters traveled between towns offering their services to families who wished to preserve likenesses of loved ones. Using oil paints on stretched canvas, these artists captured careful representations that might be displayed inside homes for generations. Mapmaking represented another creative and practical skill during this period. Surveyors ventured into forests and along rivers to chart land boundaries and record geographic features. Their measurements helped define property lines and contributed to the gradual mapping of colonial territories. Weather patterns continued to influence daily experiences throughout the year. Coastal storms sometimes battered harbors with powerful winds that strained ropes securing ships to docks. Inland areas faced sudden thunderstorms during warm months, bringing heavy rain that refreshed crops but occasionally damaged buildings or roads. The natural world remained deeply present in colonial awareness. Migrating geese crossed the sky in organized formations each autumn and spring. Fireflies illuminated summer evenings with tiny flashes of light drifting above grassy fields. Gardens near homes provided spaces where beauty and usefulness blended together. Flowers such as marigolds and lavender grew beside vegetables and herbs, adding color and fragrance to otherwise practical landscapes. In quiet moments between duties, individuals sometimes walked beyond their houses to observe the surrounding countryside. Rolling hills, winding rivers, and distant forests formed scenes that changed gradually with each season. Although colonial life required steady labor and careful attention to survival, these small experiences offered reminders of the wider environment in which communities existed. Over time, traditions, skills, and shared memories shaped the identity of each settlement. Customs developed gradually as generations adapted to the conditions of a land both challenging and abundant. And as these colonies continued to grow, their inhabitants faced an uncertain future shaped by shifting alliances, evolving ideas, and events that would soon alter the course of their world in ways few could yet fully imagine. As the colonies matured, patterns of daily life continued to evolve alongside expanding settlements and growing populations. Roads that once connected only a handful of farms gradually widened into more reliable routes used by travelers, merchants, and messengers moving between distant regions. Wagons creaked steadily along these paths, carrying goods from inland communities toward coastal ports where ships waited to cross the Atlantic. Postal riders became an increasingly familiar presence along these roads. Mounted on sturdy horses, they carried leather satchels filled with letters, newspapers, and official documents. Their journeys covered long distances across forests, rivers, and towns, linking scattered communities through the exchange of information. The arrival of such riders often attracted attention, as news from distant places offered glimpses of events beyond the immediate horizon. Within larger towns, coffee houses and taverns developed into gathering spaces where ideas circulated alongside food and drink. Wooden tables filled these rooms, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Candles burned in iron holders, casting a warm glow over groups of patrons who spent hours discussing trade, weather, and developments occurring across the colonies. Printed newspapers, though still limited in number, found their way into these establishments. Sheets of paper covered with small lines of type carried reports from distant ports, announcements of shipping arrivals, and commentary on public matters. Readers sometimes passed the pages among one another, allowing many eyes to follow the same columns of text. Booksellers also appeared in some urban areas. Their modest shops contained shelves stacked with volumes imported from Europe or produced by colonial presses. Titles covered a range of subjects including religion, philosophy, navigation, and agriculture. For those who could read, these books offered a quiet form of exploration that extended beyond the boundaries of their immediate surroundings. Scientific curiosity began to take root among certain members of colonial society. Amateur naturalists observed plants, insects, and birds, recording details within handwritten notebooks. Specimens were sometimes dried and preserved, then stored carefully within wooden cabinets for later study. Gardens belonging to these enthusiasts occasionally contained unusual varieties of plants gathered from different regions. Seeds exchanged between travelers allowed certain species to appear far from their original habitats. Over time, These small botanical collections added diversity to colonial landscapes. In port cities, the rhythm of maritime life continued without pause. Shipbuilders hammered planks into place along expanding waterfront yards where vessels rose gradually from wooden frameworks. The smell of tar and fresh timber drifted through the air while teams of workers moved steadily along scaffolding. When a new ship finally touched the water for the first time, the moment carried a quiet sense of accomplishment. The hull slipped carefully down greased wooden rails before settling into the harbor, ready to begin a life of voyages across unpredictable seas. Sailors preparing for departure gathered supplies necessary for long journeys. Barrels of salted meat, dried beans, hard biscuits, and fresh water were loaded into storage compartments below deck. Navigational instruments were secured carefully within the captain's quarters. Once sails unfurled and ropes were loosened, the vessel moved slowly away from the dock. Wind filled the canvas, guiding the ship outward toward open water where waves stretched endlessly toward distant continents. Back on land, colonial communities continued adjusting to the challenges of population growth. New houses appeared along town edges, and farmland extended further into surrounding countryside. Surveyors measured land parcels using chains and compasses, recording boundaries within official maps and documents. Public buildings gradually became more prominent within expanding towns. Courthouses, warehouses, and administrative offices reflected the increasing complexity of colonial governance. Officials gathered in these spaces to organize taxation, regulate trade, and address disputes between citizens. Militia training also formed part of community life. Groups of local men assembled periodically on open fields where they practiced marching formations and handling muskets. These exercises aimed to ensure readiness in case of external threats or internal unrest. Uniforms varied widely, often consisting of ordinary clothing accompanied by simple equipment such as powder horns and cartridge boxes. Despite the informal appearance of these gatherings, they represented an early form of organized defense within colonial society. Education continued spreading gradually through expanding networks of schools. Teachers instructed students in reading, writing, arithmetic, and classical literature drawn from European traditions. Some institutions began offering more advanced studies in subjects like mathematics, navigation, and natural philosophy. Young individuals with academic ambitions sometimes traveled abroad to continue their education. European universities provided opportunities to study law, medicine, or theology. Upon returning, these scholars contributed new knowledge to colonial intellectual life. Printing presses increased their output as literacy expanded. Pamphlets discussing political philosophy, economics, and social organization circulated among readers eager to understand the changing world around them. Ideas traveled quickly along trade routes connecting cities, towns, and villages. Artisans also benefited from growing demand for skilled work. Cabinet makers produced increasingly refined furniture featuring carved decorations and polished surfaces. Silversmiths crafted delicate utensils and ornamental objects that reflected both practicality and artistry. Music found a place within certain households where instruments such as harpsichords or violins accompanied evening gatherings. Sheet music printed in European cities sometimes appeared among these collections, allowing colonial musicians to perform compositions heard across the Atlantic. Clothing styles gradually evolved as imported fabrics and patterns influenced local fashion. Tailors adapted European designs to suit colonial conditions, creating garments that balanced appearance with durability. Wool, linen, and occasionally silk appeared within wardrobes belonging to wealthier residents. Despite these developments, rural life continued maintaining its familiar pace. Farmers rose early to tend livestock, repair fences, and monitor crops growing across fields shaped by generations of labor. The smell of soil warmed by sunlight remained a constant presence during planting and harvest seasons. Travelers moving between countryside and town often noticed the contrast between these environments. Quiet landscapes of farms and forests gave way to busy streets filled with carts, pedestrians, and shop fronts. Each setting carried its own rhythm, yet both formed essential parts of colonial society. Natural forces continued influencing life in powerful ways. Rivers flooded during heavy rains, altering familiar shorelines. Storms occasionally swept through coastal regions with winds strong enough to damage ships and buildings. Communities rebuilt patiently after such events, using local resources and collective effort. Wild landscapes still surrounded many settlements despite ongoing expansion. Dense woods, marshlands, and mountain ranges formed natural boundaries that limited rapid growth. These regions remained home to diverse wildlife and plant life observed by hunters, travelers, and naturalists alike. As decades passed, children born within the colonies grew into adulthood carrying experiences shaped entirely by this new environment. Their understanding of the land differed from earlier settlers who had arrived from distant shores. For this generation, colonial towns, farms, rivers, and forests represented the only world they had ever known. Gradually, a shared identity began forming among these communities. Though each colony maintained distinct customs and laws, common experiences of labor, trade, weather, and landscape created subtle connections across great distances. Everyday life remained grounded in familiar routines. Fires lit before sunrise, tools lifted for daily work, meals prepared from the land's harvest, and evenings spent beneath candlelight or starlit skies. These quiet patterns sustained families through years marked by both hardship and resilience. Across farms, ports, towns, and frontier cabins, individuals continued building lives shaped by persistence and adaptation. Their efforts carved settlements from forests, established markets along rivers, and created communities where traditions took root in unfamiliar soil. Over time, these countless small actions, planting fields, constructing homes, raising children, and maintaining connections between neighbors, formed the foundation of a society gradually emerging across the vast landscape of North America. And while the future remained uncertain, the rhythms of daily life endured, carried forward by generations who shaped their world through steady labor, shared knowledge, and an enduring relationship with the land that surrounded them. Even as towns and settlements grew, many colonists maintained connections with the wilderness beyond the cleared fields and cultivated gardens. Forests, rivers, and wetlands continued to shape life in ways both practical and profound, influencing the materials people used, the food they consumed, and the skills required to navigate these spaces. Those who moved beyond the immediate bounds of settlement carried knowledge that linked the domestic world with the untamed environment surrounding it. Hunting remained an essential activity for food, trade, and survival. Deer, rabbits, turkeys, and other game moved quietly through woodlands, their habits observed by generations of colonists. Hunters often tracked animals for hours, reading footprints in mud, broken branches, and disturbed leaves. The ability to predict an animal's movements relied on patience, attentiveness, and familiarity with local patterns of wildlife. Trapping also provided supplemental income and goods for households. Simple devices constructed from wood, rope, and iron captured smaller animals like foxes, mink, and muskrats. The pelts were cleaned, stretched, and sometimes dyed to prepare them for sale in markets or to trade for other essentials. Fur remained a valuable commodity in both domestic and international trade networks, linking the frontier directly to distant urban centers. Fishing, both in rivers and along the coast, contributed significantly to colonial diets. Nets, traps, and lines required careful preparation and constant maintenance. Riverbanks were lined with improvised docks or wooden platforms where fish were cleaned and salted before storage. In coastal regions, larger vessels enabled deeper water expeditions, often requiring crews to spend multiple days at sea navigating tidal currents and unpredictable weather. The knowledge required to sustain such activities was shared across generations. Parents taught children the proper handling of tools, the timing of seasons, and the subtle behaviors of animals. Skills developed in these moments carried practical significance, ensuring that families could supplement agricultural production with protein sources, fibers, and materials essential for survival. Forests provided far more than game and wood. Many households gathered edible plants, berries, and nuts that grew naturally among trees. Wild onions, ramps, and fiddlehead ferns appeared in spring, while autumn brought hazelnuts, acorns, and wild apples. Knowledge of these resources contributed to household resilience, particularly during harsh seasons when crops failed or market goods were scarce. Water from streams, springs, and wells shaped the positioning of homes and farms. Settlers preferred locations where fresh water was abundant yet manageable, providing for household needs, livestock, and irrigation. Simple aqueducts or channels sometimes directed water to gardens or fields, reflecting an early understanding of practical hydrology. Firewood, gathered from nearby woods, remained the primary source of heat and fuel for cooking. Cutting, splitting, and stacking wood required consistent effort, particularly in preparation for winter months. Each household developed strategies to ensure sufficient supply, often preserving multiple years' worth of seasoned logs in covered sheds or lean-tos. The domestic sphere itself continued to expand in complexity. Bedrooms remained simple but functional, often shared by multiple family members. Bedding consisted of straw mattresses or stuffed ticks covered with woven cloth. Heavy quilts or blankets provided warmth, supplemented by proximity to the hearth when needed. Storage of food and household goods required careful organization. Root cellars, dug into hillsides, offered cool environments for storing potatoes, turnips, and other vegetables through winter. Jars and barrels held preserved fruits, salted meat, and grains, their contents monitored and rotated to prevent spoilage. Households also developed systems for managing waste and recycling materials. Bones were collected for soup stocks or fertilizer. Broken pottery could be repurposed for garden drainage, and worn clothing was transformed into rags for cleaning or patching. Education and skill development continued within these environments. Children learned not only practical trades, but also cultural and moral lessons through observation and participation. Spinning, weaving, carpentry, and cooking combined technical instruction with repetition and patience, allowing young people to contribute meaningfully to family labor. Religious practice intertwined with daily responsibilities. Many families incorporated prayer and reading of scripture into morning or evening routines. Observances were woven naturally into domestic work rather than existing as isolated events, reflecting a worldview in which spiritual and practical life remained closely linked. Seasonal change continued to guide activities. Spring brought planting, pruning, and preparation of garden beds. Summer required diligent attention to crops, livestock, and maintenance of fences and buildings. Autumn presented harvests, food preservation, and preparation for winter. Winter demanded repair work, care of indoor livestock, and preservation of stored provisions. Transportation remained a critical concern. Horses, oxen, and mules carried goods and people over primitive roads that were often difficult to navigate after rain or snow. Carts, sleds, and rafts allowed heavier cargo to move efficiently when conditions permitted. Navigation required skill and caution, particularly across rivers, hills, or newly cleared land. Communities relied on networks of cooperation. Neighbors assisted one another in planting and harvesting, repairing homes, or constructing shared infrastructure such as bridges, mills, or fences. Collective effort was essential in overcoming both environmental challenges and the limitations of individual households. Social and economic distinctions shaped life alongside these shared tasks. Landowners controlled the largest portions of arable ground, while laborers, indentured servants, and enslaved people provided the workforce necessary to cultivate it. Artisans and merchants occupied a different tier, producing goods and facilitating trade that linked households and settlements across the colonies. Markets reflected these differences clearly. Farmers brought surplus crops to town centers, where buyers assessed quality and negotiated prices. Skilled artisans sold handmade goods, while merchants offered imported wares including tools, cloth, and luxury items. Observing these exchanges revealed a spectrum of wealth, access, and opportunity within colonial society. Health remained a constant concern. Illnesses such as smallpox, dysentery, and respiratory infections could spread quickly, especially in denser communities. Families relied on a combination of traditional remedies, herbal knowledge, and the guidance of local healers to manage disease. Clean water, adequate nutrition, and careful preparation of food proved essential to survival. Even as settlements expanded, colonists maintained an acute awareness of the natural world. Birds, insects, and mammals moved in patterns that shaped daily routines. Storms, tides, and seasonal shifts dictated work schedules. The environment demanded attention, observation, and adaptation, reinforcing the interdependence of human and natural systems. Craftsmanship evolved in response to these conditions. Furniture reflected durability as well as function, often constructed from locally available woods and finished with oils or wax. Metal tools and hardware required careful forging and maintenance. Clothing combined practicality with modest ornamentation, balancing protection against the elements with aesthetic sensibilities imported from European traditions. In towns, the arrival of news, mail, and visitors connected distant regions. Travelers carried information about political developments, shipping schedules, and social events. Merchants, officials, and clergy helped disseminate these messages, forming a network of communication that extended across colonies and beyond. Despite the pressures of labor, survival, and adaptation, moments of quiet reflection persisted. Watching the sun rise over fields, observing the pattern of river currents, or listening to the wind through tree branches offered a sense of continuity and perspective. Life in the colonies demanded resilience, but it also encouraged attentiveness to the subtle rhythms of the world around each household. In these interconnected layers of activity, labor, trade, domestic management, observation, and learning, the colonies gradually coalesced into a distinctive society. The experiences of daily life, whether in remote cabins, bustling towns, or expansive plantations, created a shared culture grounded in adaptation to the environment, reliance on community, and careful stewardship of limited resources. By the close of the 18th century, the cumulative weight of these everyday practices had transformed the landscape. Fields stretched farther, settlements grew denser, roads became more navigable, and trade networks extended across the Atlantic. Each act of labor, each household ritual, each small decision contributed to a society that was both practical and resilient, capable of sustaining itself even as it faced the uncertainties of a rapidly changing world. Through centuries of adaptation, observation, and effort, the people of colonial America built lives that reflected the interplay of land, labor, and social organization. Their homes, towns, and fields were not merely sites of survival. They were spaces where knowledge, skill, and human relationships were cultivated over time, forming the foundation of a culture rooted in endurance, ingenuity, and a profound connection to the natural world. Even now, walking along fields, rivers, or quiet town streets, one can sense echoes of these patterns: the careful tending of the land, the rhythms of domestic life, and the enduring mark of communities shaped over generations. The story of colonial life is not only one of grand events, but also the accumulation of countless ordinary moments, each contributing to the emergence of a society that would continue to evolve in the centuries to follow.